Welcome to a new Stay Connected webinar. It's our pleasure to welcome today to a session in which we will discuss about leadership in times of crisis. My name is Luis Vives, and I'm the Deputy Dean for Programs at Esade. And we will have today with us for this webinar two experienced executives that will share with us their insights on how to lead in crisis times. On the one hand, we will be connecting live with Australia, with Perth, with Terry Agnew, who is a non-executive chair, director, and advisor, and up till recently, he was the CEO of RAC in Western Australia. At the same time, and connecting from Madrid, we have Manolo Marquez. Manolo Marquez is today an advisor, the chairman of our Esade MBA master project, as well as the executive in residence at the strategy department in Esade. The idea of this talk is to learn from their insights, but at the same time, we will be welcoming your questions. So if you would like to ask them any question, please write it down through YouTube or through LinkedIn, and we will address your questions at the end of this conversation. Hello, Terry. Hello, Manolo. How are you?
Hi.
Well, thank you, Luis.
Hi, Luis.
So you have had the opportunity to lead different companies in times of crisis. Which one do you remember the most and why?
Okay, let me start, Luis, and good evening, Terry, and good afternoon, Luis. I believe there are one thing in common between crisis and love relationships, and this is the first and the last are the ones that you remember most vividly. My last recession was in 2012. At that time, the European sovereign debt crisis exploded, and Europe came into a second dip of recession just after a few years of the global financial crisis. I was running Hudson, CEO of Hudson, a recruiting company which had $400 million in net revenues, mostly coming from the fees of 12,000 permanent placements across the globe. Even though I was based in New York and Hudson was an American company, close to half of our revenues came from Europe. And most of our clients, what they did, what they used to do when they have the preliminary hints of a recession is they engage in a hiring freeze. And that's kind of like the most terrible enemy of a recruiting company. We saw 1/4 of our revenues evaporate suddenly into the thin air, and we had to start executing fast cost trimming actions. And that was difficult for us for two reasons. First of all, as a professional services company, most of our costs were fixed. They come from our people, and real estate. But secondly, after the global financial crisis of 2008, the company had to go through enormous right sizing, and the most difficult restructuring is that the one that you have to execute the second. It's incredibly challenging. But let me refer to my first crisis too. I do sympathize with the young generation that might be coming into the job market right now in this impending crisis. Also, the generation that might be now in their mid-30s who came into the job market after the global financial crisis, and just as they were kind of like recovering and prospering, they are now going to be hit by a potential second recession. And I remember my first recession, and in those times, when it hits you for the first time, you do think that the world as you've seen it is over, that is never going to be the same again. Now, after some years, you get perspective. You have seen and you understand that recessions come and go, that they are the inevitably fact that comes fully ingrained with economic development, and that the future, your future, it's not what the current hazards and threats point to, but what we collectively want to make of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Manolo. What about you, Terry? Which one is the crisis that you remember the most?
Luis, I think for the last 12 months I've been a director of organisations and not a full-time executive. So I have sympathy for CEOs with the current challenge with COVID-19, because there's a health crisis which hopefully we're largely through in 12 months. But then we have you would see that we're going to have a long-term economic crisis that could well last 3-5 years or more. So it's actually getting through one crisis into another. So at the moment, my involvement is as a director of organisations, and having been through crisis before, I think that's useful to have sitting around the board table. But it's a tough gig for the CEO. When I was a chief executive, the crises, there were two that were very close to each other. One was the global financial crisis, with all the sort of impacts that Manolo mentioned, with largely financial services and significantly impacted. And then only just after a year after that hitting, we were hit with our insurance business with a $1 billion hailstorm in the city I live in. And that was, I think, the 7th largest insurance catastrophe globally that year. And we were a million customer base and revenue of about 600 million, but we had to deal with both of those. And the reason I remember them and why they're in my mind is, firstly, because they're crises, you're dealing with big impacts, certainly bigger than you're normally used to dealing with in a business. Secondly, in this instance, it was back-to-back. It's a bit like the current challenge of having to deal with a substantial health crisis. But even when that's complete or largely complete, there's then a longer-term big economic crisis. And just to compound issues in the ones that I'm talking about, we had only just made a very big acquisition prior to that. And then further to compound it, we were partway through a major IT transformation. So it was almost a perfect storm, not quite. So I think that's what I recall, and hopefully that learning's been useful around some of the board tables I'm sitting on now.
Mm-hmm. Actually, regarding your experience in different crises, we would like to ask you about what are your top 3 key learnings from managing in those times?
Yeah. Shall I go first, Luis? Okay. So look, I think the first thing is in a really big crisis is the existing systems and processes don't work. So you don't have a rule book, and so you need to be flexible and agile in the way you respond, because the processes that work well in business as usual will not work in a substantial crisis. I think the second one, Luis, is around people. That engaging with your people around communication and being visible, seeing the people as core to what you're trying to achieve, and not seeing them as excluded from that. They're critical in terms of maintaining those links to your customer base. And then they're also critical, they're your core capability as you come out of the worst parts of the crisis and you're looking for what you do thereafter, post-crisis. And probably that's the third one is the post-crisis piece. It's easy to be subsumed with the challenges of the current, but you also need to keep an eye on the future and how do you make sure you're well positioned for that. And the sort of behaviours, I think, Luis, out of that is a lot of them are behaviours that you would want an executive or a CEO to have anyway, but they're just even more important. So things around trusted, authentic, being visible, being credible, listening. And then there's other key things in there, like being decisive. You need to make decisions with incomplete information. Ensuring that you're flexible and adaptable. And then I think really important for the leader, your own resilience and kind of looking after yourself, I'll call that, because you don't want the leader to fall over. So they're sort of some of the behaviours, most of which you would want in an organisation and from a leader anyway, but even more important, I think, in a crisis.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Terry. What about you, Manolo?
Well, first of all, I fully agree with everything that Terry has said. Thinking about special lessons that I might have learned through a crisis, I think that one of the things that surprised me the most is that usually people react to a crisis like a deer in the headlights. They freeze up. They might intellectually understand the danger and the need to react, but many people lack the ability to internalize the new reality. And that is so because fear, threats, emotions are always much more powerful than reason. And denial is the first coping mechanism that we have in front of tragedy. In fact, during this COVID crisis, we've seen many instances of major politicians that were seeing how the pandemic was affecting one after the other their neighboring countries, and they still thought that this was not going to happen to them. People try to protect their old ways of doing things. They try to keep on embracing their old beliefs. So because of this, my first learning that I like to share with you is that the leader has to really shake up their organization. They need to expedite the need for change across their company. They need to very fast recalibrate the company vision and recast their plans. My second learning is that the most urgent things that you need to do before even planning for the future is protect the present. And this means you have to put cash management as a key priority at the very center of your agenda. You might want to implement a cash war room when you and your team think aggressively about potential initiatives to save cash. You might want to implement cash dashboards that you share across all your management organizations so that you engage all your middle management in looking closely at how you are expending your cash. You reduce your expenses, you reprioritize your capital expenditures, you negotiate with your banks to expand your lines of credits, you negotiate, you talk with your main suppliers to try to leverage on them as much as possible. So my second learning is that during crisis, a leader needs to be as much an operational leader as a strategic one. Third learning would be that you need to be extremely agile. I have always regretted not to have taken some of the actions earlier rather than being forced to take these actions later on. The main questions that you have to ask when you see a potential action is not why, but why not? And the winner after the crisis is not the brightest, but the quickest. And I'll give you a 4-layer learning, which is Terry has mentioned the importance of communicating with your people, engage with them. I would expand that and say that you have to engage with all your stakeholders. Obviously your people, but your board, your clients, your suppliers, and obviously your shareholders.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that you have to do right now is you have to deal with a lot of uncertainty. And it's very important to address this uncertainty and to be able to plan ahead. So there is a lot of discussions going on right now on scenario planning. How do you take scenario planning? What's the use of scenario planning in a situation like the one that we are facing right now, or the one in which you were managing companies in previous crises?
Well, to put it shortly, I would say that you have to deal with a scenario planning with urgent thoroughness. So as Terry has mentioned before, there's no perfect information. You have stressed that too, Luis. But also there is no time to fully complete an analysis of a scenario. And yet you cannot get carried away by gut instincts. So you have to gather your team. You have to rely on outside experts, but you have to bring courage and resolution in the team when you explore the different options. In other words, you examine the risk collectively, but you have to take your own decisions. And I think that under scenario planning, you can think of three buckets of actions mainly. The first bucket I will label stop the bleeding. And those are the actions that help you protect your cash and your bottom line. Mainly, you look for variable expense savings, targeted redundancy calls, and you think whether this is going to be a V shape, a U shape, an L shape recession, and adjust the depth and the scope of those type of actions accordingly. My recommendation, however, is when you do this, prepare for the worst and hope the best. The second bucket of actions I would label the get back in shape actions. Those are the ones that allow you to build resilience under a potentially prolonged adverse scenario. Those actions might encompass in right sizing, maybe repurposing part of your organization. And my feeling and my advice here would be work sooner rather than later on those type of actions, because the economy, whether it's a V, U shape, L shape, but it's never going to be the same after a crisis. And the third bucket is the one that encompasses the actions that allow you to be prepared to win. And these prepared to win actions, you think strategically to try to envision what will be the new normal after the recession. Those might include capital reallocation actions, potentially divestitures, acquisitions to take advantage of the fact that you might have a weakest competitor that you could acquire, investing in deploying new technology, investing in your people, developing your people, and doing some targeted key hires so you enhance your human capital. In a way, crisis brings also opportunities, and you cannot miss the chance to benefit from them.
Excellent. Terry, you are facing now a crisis from a position as a chairman and working with executive teams. How do you address this scenario planning? What are your takes on it? What are your learnings?
Yeah, so interesting, Manolo, talking about, one of the things is typically the leader or the CEO is diving more into operational matters, and I'm finding a couple of instances where I'm now the chair. I have in each of those two very capable CEOs, but what I'm doing is spending more time, and particularly around the understanding what's the worst case and how do we respond. And so, I see the scenario planning as really important. And it's important because it gives you a framework to be able to make decisions. You're not doing it as an academic exercise. You're doing it to help you make decisions. And so it is ultimately around your cash position and your solvency. And the key is don't run out of cash. If you run out of cash, you do not have a business. So it's actually using it for that purpose to drive decisions. And it's in this environment where there's incomplete information, there's urgency required on decisions, there's generally more emotion running around the organisation. And so the scenarios give you that sort of framework. And what I've found is I think if you're not involved and embroiled in the day-to-day, you can step back and ensure there are more demanding scenarios. So I think the example, Luis, I used with you a few days ago was, look, in often what's painted as the worst case, we'll now make it a worst case. Or if that's bad, run me a scenario that's badder and baddest, because typically the people within the organisation won't necessarily be able to think as broadly. Part of a board's role is to force that breadth of thinking, or to stimulate that breadth of thinking. So I find it valuable. It's really important to have scenario planning to drive decision making. That's why you're doing it. And what you're trying to do is to ensure that the organisation can not only survive the present, but is sustainable going forward in financial terms, which means it can then take advantage of these opportunities Manolo talked about.
But we are learning from your experience that probably we are not negative enough when planning the negative scenarios. So we need to push hard, and we need to understand what may be a real worst case in our planning. Yes,
well, that is my view.
Let me link this with one of the questions that we are already getting through our LinkedIn channel, which is, how can you plan if we have a lack of data or with all this uncertainty? Can you try to give us some wisdom on that? How can we try to think ahead with imperfect information?
Well, maybe if I give a simple example, and then Manolo, I'm sure, has ones he can draw on too. It doesn't have to. You do have incomplete information, and it's just exacerbated because of the crisis. But it's almost, some of it is. Let me give an example. It might be, look, we don't know how this crisis will impact. We don't know how long it will last in terms of the health crisis. We don't know what the impact will be on revenue, and so take an extreme example. What if our revenue was cut in half? Now, for some organisations, that might be a best case scenario, but cut in half, what does that now look like if we look out over the next 12 months? What does that mean in terms of our expense base? And so actually starting to think those through, and then getting a handle regularly on how far off are we on our assumptions? Not in great detail, but gee, what we thought 2 weeks ago was way too optimistic. Now we need to dive in deeper. So it's that flexibility and agility, not only on processes, but also in understanding your position. But it is incomplete information. But it's taking probably a more pessimistic view, or what might be seen at the time as more pessimistic, and then understanding the ramifications for the organisation, and then knowing what things need to look like to make the decision because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say the same. But in a way, it's not different than any business decision. I mean, you never have perfect information. I think that you have to analyze it enough, but in the end, you have to have the courage to decide. And under crisis, this is just exacerbated. And when we usually call the paralysis by analysis, I mean, here, I mean, you have to be thorough, because obviously you cannot just have your gut instincts, but you have to bring courage and decisiveness more than in any other times.
Thank you. We are talking a lot these days about purpose. In fact, in the last few months, this has been an incredible. There has been an incredible growth in the number of papers and discussions talking about purpose. How important are purpose and values during a crisis?
Yeah, well, certainly my view, Luis, is personally, I think they're critical. I think if you think of your own, just park business a moment, if you think your own personal situation, when you get really tough decisions in your personal life and you're trying to find a way to a solution, it's very often and very frequent that you fall back on who you are, what your personal values are, to help you. And you may consciously do that, or you may unconsciously do that. And I think my view is, and it's the same in business. You know, when you have tough decisions to make in business, whether in a crisis or not, it's going back to the bedrock of the organisation, the DNA of the organisation, which is around its purpose and values. And it's even more important than at a time of crisis, when you have bigger impacts, you have more uncertainty, you have more challenging timeframes to make those decisions. So I think it's really important. Perhaps give an example from the crisis that I mentioned when I was an executive. I think in that case, it was we had 1 million customers called members, so we were a mutual. And so the customer, the consumer, was the core of what we do. In dealing with them really well was a core part of where we were strategically different. And so that was one of the things we fell back on when we were deciding. So as we worked through job cuts during the global financial crisis, we worked really hard to protect the front line, because they were the ones dealing with the consumer. Similarly, when this hailstorm hit and we had huge issues, mainly in coping with the demand, in 1 hour, we had the equivalent of 8 months of claims generated on top of what we normally get in every day. So again, in that case, it was how to respond in that crisis and use people from across the organisation to ensure we were doing as well as we could in dealing with the consumer. So in both those examples I gave, we fell back on the purpose and the values of the organisation, and that was at a cost to some other things.
Mm-hmm. Manolo, what's your take on purpose?
Well, once more, I'm in full agreement with Terry, and on my own personal style, I've tried very hard to put purpose and values at heart, and I have said that I have been rewarded for that. However, I would like to kind of like bring a little bit of realism here, because a crisis is not completely different than a battle. In fact, a crisis is a battle for economic survival. And in a battle, bright and dark forces are at play. And you can see the best of people, and you can also see the worst of people. Under stress, most people tend to regress to a state of greater dependence. It calls for leaders that can soothe their collective fears and anxieties. And in those communities, whether organizations, societies, in psychological regression, sometimes highly incompetent, autocratic leaders rise in popularity. And the purpose, the only purpose that matters in that context, is self-interest. And unfortunately, history has given us plenty of example when after a crisis, authoritarian regimes came to place. So I just want to be cautious with that. My belief, my personal belief, is like Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, is that the power of the Force is much greater than that of the dark side, and that inspirational leaders can provide the guidance to help us master our fears and anxieties. And they do that by igniting our solidarity, by joining us in a fight together, in fighting together for a common cause, in a way, they drive the two most powerful drives that are ingrained in the human spirit, which are purpose and pride. And they engage us in our personal quest to search for our sense of meaning and our sense of belonging. And I truly believe that is these inspirational leaders which are always the big winners after a crisis.
Excellent. We have several questions that are coming through the chat, both via YouTube as well as LinkedIn. In fact, I'm happy to see some familiar names, some of our MBA graduates also writing questions to the two speakers that we have. So let me try to distribute some questions and let me try to take your views on it. So Terry, CEOs during a crisis have to deal with unpopular decisions. How do you manage? How do you deal with those?
Yeah, so look, I think CEOs, even outside a crisis, A, it's a lonely job, and B, you are having to make from time to time unpopular or controversial decisions. So that's part of the game. In a crisis, that's heightened because of all those things we've talked about. You're making those decisions with a greater urgency, with more uncertainty, with a lot of emotion in the organisation. But I think it's coming back to, well, what's your objective? And your objective, the how is ultimately what your objective is. You want the organisation to survive and be sustainable. And so your decisions should be hooked back to survival in the short term, but sustainability in the long term. Sustainability can mean also taking those growth opportunities. And so that might be, changes in the way your business model works. What we're seeing at the moment is an acceleration of people being prepared to work from home, an acceleration of consumers prepared to transact digitally and so on. So it's taking some of those, but then also, as Manolo mentioned, opportunities will come up for M&A with organisations that may not be in as strong a shape. So I think it's linking back always to making the decisions with what's in the best interest of the organisation's long-term survival. And so the hows is for the CEO to focus on falling back on that, to remember that making a decision is better than making no decisions. I think treating people in the organisation and customers, if they're impacted, with respect, whether it's impacting them or not, you want to treat them with respect. And I think a key one in all this for the CEO, and I don't think I've mentioned it earlier, is the CEO needs to have really good self-awareness of their own health and wellness and where they're at, and that's really hard. So I think in making those decisions, making sure the CEO needs to be aware of, well, am I fresh? Am I fresh enough to make this decision? Or am I making it under duress? And you need to think about how you might get more input, not over a long period of time, but maybe for some other people. So I think they're the things I would see. Hanging it back ultimately to your role is to ensure the long-term sustainability of the organisation.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Manolo, how do you keep people motivated in such a stressful and difficult situation?
Sorry, Luis, I've lost you for a second.
Sorry. I was asking you, Manolo, if you could tell us how can you keep people motivated under a lot of stress and in such a difficult situation like a crisis or today with the COVID-19? What would be your recommendation?
I usually say that am I getting through finally? I've got some break up in the. Hello? You hear me well?
Yes.
You hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that one of the major roles that a leader has to play under crisis is that of chief engagement we sometimes think that people listen to what the leader says, but they don't listen so much to what he or she says, but rather they observe what they do. And in a crisis more than at any other time, you have to lead by example. You have to switch frequently between directive leadership style and a coaching leadership style. When you do that, you have to be aware that even if you do a great performance as a leader, that your performance might be cushioned by a passive middle management layer. So the whole thing has to go through the transmission belt of your middle management. And sometimes it's not very efficient. So one of the things you have to do is work with your middle management, coach them, train them, develop them, sometimes replace them. The three things that you cannot delegate in terms of dealing with your people and their crisis. You have to keep on communicating directly with them and ensure that your communications are not only frequent, but that they are simple and consistent. Remember that you don't need to tell them over and over the what. Those are the words. They want to spot behaviors. You have to focus on the how. And to do that, you have to identify role models in your organization, change agents, put them under spotlight, share the good news, acknowledge and recognize good examples and exemplary behaviors. The second thing that I would recommend a leader does directly is address personally the bad news. So go in front of your people, tell them about the layouts, be clear about the scope of the layouts and the rationale of that. Very important thing gets eroded easily. Be sensitive with the people that you let go and be generous. And the third thing that I would recommend is don't think about one-way communications. Engage in bottom-up communication. Give your people a voice. Listen to their problems. Try to understand their feelings. Involve them in helping you spot implementation bottlenecks and work out solutions for them. In fact, try hard to create a true sense of shared ownership of your company futures among all ranks.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you with a set of questions, and I will highly appreciate if you can provide answers in 30 seconds or less, because the idea is to try to include as many questions as possible, and we will be closing this webinar in just about 5 minutes. So the first one coming from LinkedIn is, how do you push your CEO to move with agility when he or she remains stopped, when you see him or her not moving? Terry, what do we have to do? What would be your advice?
Look, that is a very good question and a very challenging question. I think it's important that your views are reflected to the CEO, and then how you do that may be a mix of how well you know them personally and can talk candidly to them, or it may be instead of that, or in parallel, finding someone you know is a trusted advisor to them and discussing the issue with them. So I think, like any communication, finding more than one way to try to get the message through. But you must try to get the message through, and then it's really a case of whether the CEO acts on it or not.
Okay. Manolo, would you say that breaking the normal structure of a company and empowering individuals so they can create their own task forces could help to bring resilience to a company?
Yes, but you need to move very fast on a single direction. So you have to be very careful when you do that. And this is kind of like this double act that you always have to say. You have to involve your people, but you have to provide them with directions. You have to switch between a coaching style and be more of a player coach and be directive. So that's part of the art of leadership. You have to be both at the same time.
In fact, we have a question that is specifically referred to you, Manolo, which is about giving visibility to middle managers on cash management. Is there a risk that at the end you may end up with a group of discontent managers due to different opinions?
Well, I mean, I think you have to prepare your middle management. You have to watch them closely. Is run training workshop for middle management where I was directly involved. But they have to be equipped to do it. And if you cannot trust them to do the right thing, you'll have to replace them. And that's one of the things that I have kind of referred to that before, that one of the things that I regret is not having made some of the moves earlier than I had to execute later on. And replacing people is one of those. You kind of think, why should I replace this or that person? I'll give it another try. Under crisis, if you don't have the appropriate managers, they are absolutely essential. Don't hesitate to replace them.
Okay. There is another question that I would invite any of the two to reply to that says, how can we overcome denial as a leader? Is there a recommendation or advice to try to do that?
Well, I think the simple answer would be look at the facts, look at the evidence. But if there's still denial, I think it just finding ways to get the leader to get input from a range of sources, as Manolo said, whether it's listening to your people or your front line, whether it's getting externals, whether it's listening to the board. But at the end of the day, it's up to the person as to whether they take that information on board and changes their view.
I mean, I would add to that that when people are in denial, that's where the fears and threats are overcoming the rational. So in my experience, it's impossible that you can get anyone out of the denial situation with a rational. So this is where you have to identify role models, people who have been able to cope with a hard situation and have been successful. And you have to show those examples to the people so that they feel that they can make it. There is no other way in my view.
Excellent. So since we have to start closing this webinar, I would like to give you the opportunity to share with the audience a final piece of advice, an insight that you think it can help them to better cope with the COVID-19 crisis that we are facing right now. Who would like to start with this final piece of advice?
I'm happy to start, Luis. Look, I think I'd come back really just to highlight some of the things I've mentioned. I think your people are critical. They're your link. They're your link to your customer base. They're your link to your future in terms of capability. You need to find all the ways to engage. Second one is your key objective is to ensure that as an organisation you survive and then are sustainable. Don't run out of cash. Third one is be ready for when you come out of the crisis. And the fourth one to the leader is, and find ways to look after yourself. You cannot afford to have the leader fall over. So you need a resilient leader. You need to be self-aware and look after yourself. Thanks.
Thank you, Terry. Manolo?
Well, I would start saying that it's very difficult to give a single advice to everyone because different industries and different companies are unevenly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. You see companies like healthcare, technology, e-commerce company, which might be thriving, while others like hospitality, travel, and leisure will be hit the hardest. So not trying to give a single recipe, but in terms of generic statements, wrapping up a little bit of what Tracy and I have shared with you today, I would recommend that you execute 3 C's: care, connect, and create. Care of the people close to you, but also care of your community and care of those in most need. This is the time for solidarity, for generosity, for fraternity. And also, as Terry has said, seek and be ready to receive care for yourself, because we all need to endure under this situation. My second advice will be connect. Involve broadly your teams, as we have said. Engage in bottom-up dialogue. Be open to feedback so that it doesn't happen to you what one of our listeners said, not CEO, not listening to some of the ranks. Secure a true shared vision and a true shared sense of ownership for your company future. And thirdly, create. Use this opportunity to advance systemic change in your organization. And remember, the future is not where these current threats point to. The future is what you want it to be, what we collectively want to make of it.
Excellent. I would like to close this webinar by saying a huge thank you both to Terry and Manolo for sharing their insights. There is a quote that I personally like a lot, and that I know both Manolo and Terry also enjoy, from Napoleon, that once said, the leader's role is to define reality and then to give hope. And I think this is something very important these days. We need to be able to face reality. We need to be able to explain people what's happening and then provide hope. Be agile, be able to create this future that Manolo was just telling to us. And in fact, I would like to recommend you all to stay connected and to keep learning. On the one hand, through this webinar series, you have more webinars coming from Stay Connected. You have another one this afternoon at 6 p.m. Spanish time. But almost daily, you have interesting contents that you can learn from. And at the same time, we will invite you to keep on learning, also coming to different executive programs. Specifically today, we were talking about the importance of addressing the unknown. And in fact, we have a program that we run together with CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, that is titled Thinking About the Unknown. And actually, one of the key drivers of this program is how can we address the issue of the unknown and how can we prepare for it. And at the same time, you have many other programs and opportunities, as well as reads that you can go through and that will help you to be better prepared in order to cope with crisis times and prepare for what comes next. And both Terry and Manolo highlighted the fact that crisis management is not just to deal with the present. You also need to address what comes next. You also need to prepare the organization to manage the trade-off between dealing with today, but even more importantly, preparing for tomorrow. Once again, thank you so much. Stay connected and keep on learning with us here at Esade. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis. Thanks, Manolo.
Thank you. Have a good evening, Terry. Bye.